Cost of living, it's a phrase we hear almost every day. But how much it actually costs to live comfortably hasn't always been factored into what workers are paid. That innovation comes from an Australian judge in 1907 in the landmark ruling known as the Harvester Judgement.
The Harvester decision was a major conceptual breakthrough that had big effect not just in Australia but around the world.
In the 19th century, the Australian colony of Victoria is a very different place.
Australia was dominated by agricultural shearing jobs, manufacturing jobs, and the 1890s was also a period of a lot of industrial disputes, and that was a period where there were breakthroughs for working people.
And that means by this time, Victoria is already a world leader in workers' rights. It adopts the 8-hour workday in 1856. That's a decade before the US outlaws slavery. And before the century is out, Victoria has wages boards to set minimum rates of pay. But these laws only target the worst offenders, like bakeries and manufacturers of clothing and furniture. Some companies have managed to fly under the radar though, like HV Mackay's Sunshine Harvester Works. Mackay is an entrepreneur and runs one of Australia's largest agricultural implement making factories. But he's only interested in doing things his way.
HV Mackay basically believed the state had no right to interfere in his business.
Until, after Federation, Mackay asks the government for help.
People like Mackay start to complain that they're facing enormous competition from the octopus ring of North American manufacturers.
And the Prime Minister at the time agrees.
Alfred Deakin introduces a bill called the Excise Tariff Act. It puts a £12 tariff on imported machines.
But this protection doesn't come for free. The government also charges a £6 excise tax on all machines, unless local manufacturers pay fair and reasonable wages to their employees.
But what the excise tariff didn't do was it didn't say what was a fair and reasonable wage.
That duty falls to Justice Henry Bourne Higgins of the Court of Arbitration in Melbourne. And because Mackay's business is so big and he's so keen to fight government intervention, even whilst asking for its help, Justice Higgins chooses the Sunshine Harvester Works as the test case.
From the very first day, it's clear that Higgins is going to make a determination that's different from all other determinations. When they're discussing profits, he says, well, profits has got nothing to do with it. What is at stake is, are you paying a fair and reasonable wage? And if it's not a fair and reasonable wage, essentially you don't deserve to be in business.
Throughout the case, the company's wages books reveal discrepancies in the way they're paying people, even for the same job. Mackay argues this is because he uses so much automated machinery in production, reducing the required skill of workers like blacksmiths.
And there's this other group of workers who are called improvers, and they are not getting full wages. And this really offends Justice Higgins.
So he decides to do something about it, using the unconventional tactic of drawing on feminist literature.
Justice Higgins asks the union lawyer, are you going to present any evidence on the cost of living? He says, now it's not normally the duty of a judge to make a recommendation to lawyers, but over the weekend I was reading a journal.
This is a piece by Vida Goldstein, Australia's highest profile women's rights activist.
And in that journal, she presented a list of budgets for people living in Victoria. And Justice Higgins said, could we have something like that?
Which is an incredibly bold thing for a judge to do at this time. And this sets the tone for the rest of the case and the way we think about a living wage.
There's no women in federal parliament, but these women are giving evidence in a major case. 3 women give evidence, and I think one of the most important of these is a woman called Kate Russell.
I am a married woman living in Bay Street, Port Melbourne. My husband is secretary to the Agricultural Implement Makers Union. Before that, he was working in Kitchen's candle factory, where he was earning 36 shillings a week. We had to do without lots of things. I was always in debt. We never had enough to live upon.
You can see that Justice Higgins is greatly moved by her evidence. He knows a lot of people at the Sunshine Harvester Works are only getting wages of, 36 shillings per week.
Justice Higgins rules that Mackay isn't paying his workers fairly, so he won't be exempt from the excise.
He sets what he thinks is a wage that will keep a family of husband and wife and 3 children in what he calls frugal comfort.
This includes the cost of things like food, housing, clothing, transport, and putting aside something for a rainy day.
And 7 shillings per day, which 6 days a week comes out to 42 shillings per week, he sets that as the minimum wage for an unskilled labourer.
So Mackay pays the new wages, but takes drastic action.
When the determination comes through, he lays off a lot of his workforce. He makes an application to the High Court. The judgment is ultra vires, it goes against the Constitution.
And the High Court sides with Mackay because the federal government has no power to determine wages or working conditions. But Justice Higgins doesn't let go. He holds on to this idea of fair and reasonable wages.
Higgins is a man not to be disposed of easily, and he makes a whole series of judgments after 1907 where he uses the principles that he's articulated in 1907 for setting wages.
It sets a benchmark.
We're the first country in the world to have the concept of a living wage.
But it isn't perfect. The Harvester Judgement is one of the first examples of women playing a major part in political action in Australia, but it leaves many of them behind.
Because the decision did assume that women were economic dependents on men, and so women's considerations in terms of what they should be paid didn't come into it because, the assumption was you had a man looking after you.
Paying women less than men had been the rule throughout industry, and the Harvester Judgement enshrines, I think, the male breadwinner as the major breadwinner. And I think that makes it harder in subsequent years for equal wages to make their impact in Australia.
So the gender pay gap is essentially institutionalised by the case we revere as one of the greatest innovations in workers' rights. And women are still fighting to correct that. The Harvester Judgement is a product of its time, but I don't think that takes away from the precedent that it set. Australia has changed a lot over the last century, but the need for a living wage hasn't.
It has continued to endure because it's a very morally strong argument, that idea that full-time workers should be able to survive on one wage.
The Harvester Judgement is still relevant because it was so human. Justice Higgins didn't tell people what they needed, he asked them. It's a lovely example of the law showing empathy to those who need it most, and that's still so important.